Welcome to the Anthro to UX podcast, where you will learn how to break into UX with an anthropology degree. Through conversations with leading anthropologists working in user experience, you will learn firsthand how others made the transition, what they learned along the way, and what they would do differently. We will be discussing what it means to do UX research from a practical perspective and what you need to do to prepare a resume and portfolio. I'm your host, Matt Artz, a business anthropologist specializing in design anthropology and working at the intersection of product management, user experience, and business strategy. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Matt Artz of Anthro to UX. Today, I'm here with Lisanne Norman. Lisanne is a UX research leader at Gusto. She was previously at Visa and Dell. She has a PhD from Harvard in African and American Studies, as well as social anthropology, and is the co-founder of Black UX in Austin, Texas. So today would be a great conversation. Going to get into some things like inclusive design. But before we get there, Lisanne, would you give us a little background? How did you come into anthropology?
It was pretty interesting. So it's been step by step. So when I was a senior at Brown, I did development studies. And part of that curriculum was, you can take an anthropology course. And at the time, I'd never taken an anthropology course and was sort of like, I guess I'll try this out. And it just turned out to be a really rich and interesting course. And I was just talking to someone about this. It was taught by, can't remember the professor's name, but she was an African-American woman. And she was just, her take on it was, very inclusive and in-depth. And she was also sort of challenging the history of it. And I was like, oh, wow, look at this discipline that takes a look at itself. And you can sort of, at the same time, we're looking at other cultures and trends. We're also sort of looking at ourselves and sort of retrospective, like what kind of work are we doing and how is this work being produced? And I took that course in college and I was like, okay, this is pretty interesting. And then when I was in grad school, I started to realize that, I really wanted to study the religious beliefs and faith practice of this African-American community. I took another anthropology of religion studies course, and I was just blown away of the ways in which to approach studying religion, through an anthropological lens and doing ethnographic research. I was really lucky to have had an amazing professor who just went in depth and also sort of, again, woman of color who sort of, showed the breadth of anthropology, right? Not just like looking at Durkheim and, sort of like, those, but also looking at, anthropologists of color who'd done work, like introducing me to Faye Harrison and her work, and really sort of, it was eye-opening for me. So then when I was thinking about the PhD, I looked at, Harvard's program, particularly because it allowed me to major in both disciplines, right? To do a degree in African-American studies, as well as in social anthropology, to be able to, sort of marry those two disciplines and really be able to use the methodology that I wanted to use in order to get at the subject, to get it deeper. So that's really sort of my path. It had a lot to do with like really incredible women of color who sort of introduced me to, other folks of color doing anthropology. And that sort of really sparked my interest and showed me that there was a space and place for my work.
Yeah, cool. And nice story. And so, but that is still a pretty far leap from what you're doing today, especially, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a program like Harvard, is not very applied in nature, right?
Not at all. In fact, it wasn't even inclusive of folks who were doing work in the United States, right? So my area, my site was, the New York metropolitan region. Mm-hmm. And there were a few comments made to me about the fact that, I'd probably end up teaching in a sociology department when I graduated, right? Because I hadn't done my work overseas or, in somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So that was also an interesting experience. So yes, miles away from all of that.
And so obviously we'll, get to how you got into UX, but maybe to just stay on that briefly. So there was the comment about, teaching in sociology. There's sort of the lack of, the applied focus. But you did have the opportunity, again, to sort of broaden your horizons and sort of read outside of the norm, which obviously is valuable. And so today you're bringing that into your work. So of course there's still value in that. But I'm curious to know, like, where, at what point, aside from working in the US, where did you sort of start to discover that you could do this work, in a more of a business context?
It really wasn't until after I graduated in 2015 and we moved to Austin, Texas. I have to be honest, I had no idea. I didn't know that, right? That because again, like as you mentioned, Harvard, they never talked to you about any kind of applied anthropology. And it was actually a fellow anthropologist who, when I got to Texas and I was like, hey, I'm not going to be able to teach at UT, the sort of agreement we had is not going to work out. And she was like, oh, but you're in like Silicon Hills, the new tech space in the United States, Austin. You have an anthropology degree. Don't you know tech companies pay anthropologists a good amount of money to talk to people? And I said, are you sure about that? Like, you're just stop it. And she was like, no, I promise you. And so I did a little research and I was like, oh, this is so interesting. Like, I didn't know that I could apply my skills, not only just apply, but that they would be valued in that particular industry, in that space. And so I kind of really just started looking around, and I found two great companies in Austin. And I went to work with one, Centier Research. And it was really interesting in many instances, right? The leadership of that company all had PhDs. So what I was finding when I first kind of started putting out my resume to another sort of research firm, they were like, oh, do you have a portfolio? And I was like, no, I don't know what that is. Like, I'm not I'm not an architect, because that's the only, like, in my head, I'm not a visual artist. And they, she sort of explained, and I was like, oh, well, no, I don't have that. What I have is a very long history of expertise in research, right? And to being able to spot trends and be able to conduct interviews and talk to people I thought that those were kind of the skills you've listed. And they were like, no. But with this company, they were like, no, we know what it takes, what's involved in the PhD, and we know you have those skills. So come on board. Here is this crazy project that's a customer journey map for Dell. Go. Oh, by the way, you have like 5 research assistants, and this is a high priority project. Go. I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. They were like, you're smart, you'll figure it out, and we'll be here. Like, we'll be here to do some hand holding, and and I have to tell you, I loved it. That was, I think to this day, probably the best job that I've ever had. And it was a great entry point into it, because as academics, we're kind of used to sort of longer research projects. So this was a year-long study into every single aspect, and I mean every single aspect of buying a personal computer. Like, they wanted to know every thought, like, what did they think? What did they do? Where did they go? How? So it was great. I was like, okay, I'm literally doing an ethnography for Dell on buying a personal computer. And so, yeah, and I had a great team, and I loved it and just kept going, honestly.
So there's a lot of things in there I'd like to dig into, but when you tell that story, it's, you tell it in a very fluid way where it makes it seem like it was like a sort of nice linear path. But it also in there sounded like you talked to a few people along the way who, again, they were looking for the portfolio. They quite didn't appreciate, the value that you would bring with your background. And so can you tell us a little bit more about maybe the struggle, like in the beginning, like were you going to meetups? Were you having to kind of network? Were you interviewing and maybe having a little bit of a struggle? I'll be honest, it was a little struggle, but not a long period of time. It really was, I reached out to this firm, and it was really that one firm that really was sort of like, well, no, you don't have this and you don't have that. And it almost made me stop. I'll be honest. I was kind of like, oh, like, well, if I don't have these, this portfolio, if I can't show that I've had, 2 years in industry, like working, like as a UX researcher. But then for a junior role. And I was like,
Yeah, no. So I was a little discouraged, but I was like, you know what? That's one company, Lisanne. You can't let, one company discourage you. And I just kind of, kept just sent out two more actually. And then Sentier got back to me very quickly. And again, I recognized that it had a lot to do with the fact that they were PhDs and that I had one, and that there was sort of like this unspoken understanding in some way.
Okay, so obviously that was a little easier for you, having the company having a number of PhDs obviously made that transition a little easier, which is great, and you're lucky for it. But of course, that's not the experience of everybody. And so since some people do still have to give portfolios, and since you already brought them up, I'd like to just ask you, have you ever made one since, or have you ever needed one since?
Funny you should ask that. So yes, I have. But it was quite a few years before I had to make one, essentially, because after I did this, I was with this research company, Sentier Research, and worked on this project for Dell. The woman that was in charge became a VP at Dell, and she was like, would you come to Dell and work on Dell.com? Because now you know so much about it. So I was like, okay, why not? Let's see. So I went to Dell, didn't have to provide a portfolio. Went as a senior UX research and did quite a bit of work helping them to improve their enterprise portal experience, as well as helping them to understand what their customers would need or want, because they just merged with EMC. So it was like a team of UX researchers from Dell and then UX researchers from EMC, and we were working together to think about how do we marry the experience for these two different types of customers. What could it look like, and do some concept testing. And that was a really fun, interesting project. And then I was headhunted to Visa. And my manager at the time was starting this brand new team to help improve the internal tool employee experience. And she didn't know anything about UX, right? She was hiring sort of us experts to help her with that. So she didn't know that we should have had a portfolio. So again, next job, no portfolio. So I was at Visa for about a year and a half, leading a team of mostly UX researchers, but one young junior designer who was amazing. Before I sort of was like, this kind of Visa, it's kind of still too traditional. And I'm kind of looking for a new experience and to grow a little bit more and to really get the experience of doing more like pair design, doing more participatory design. Mm-hmm. And so a friend told me about this e-commerce platform that was, startup in Austin. And I was like, oh, all right, I'm going to talk to them. And they were like, okay, make sure, your portfolio will be a part of the process, and it'll be a panel review. And I was like, yeah, great. Okay. It's like, and then went home and was like, oh my God, I don't have a portfolio. What am I going to do? I have 2 weeks to get this together. So I contacted, luckily, I knew a lot of UX researchers in Austin, and who had always been like, how have you never had to put together a portfolio, Lisanne? I was like, so I just really started talking to quite a few people, and just sort of, they shared their portfolios with me, I got advice and sort of about, thinking about what projects to include, what to highlight. And it's really interesting because so many people have different takes on what your portfolio is. And then too, kind of this gray area between what's a portfolio versus what's a presentation that you're going to put together and sort of, show during this. So I'm somewhere in between those two right now. And I did one for that company, and then I refreshed it when I interviewed with Gusto.
Got it. And so just to go back to Dell, and if you can't go into detail, that's fine, we can move on. But, so you got thrown into this relatively large project, not only just in terms of duration, but obviously in scope as well. Yeah. And so what was that like? Again, you said that they would, hold your hand a little bit if needed, but you still kind of got thrown in. So obviously there's a learning experience there for somebody coming out of academia. Yeah. So how did you go about that? How did you navigate that?
With a lot of doing my own, sort of reading and research, luckily there was one of my research assistants had some experience. And so I sort of, spoke with her and learned a lot from her. I had to learn how to design a survey. We're anthropologists, like we don't do surveys. And so I had to really sort of learn that skill and really sort of, read up on it. I shadowed one of the women that was a VP. She was, a great survey designer. And so I shadowed her on a few of the studies that she was doing so that I could learn and understand. But it was really a lot of, trial by fire. There were definitely even some of the interviews where I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't think we're getting any good data out of this, like no clue. And it was, and they sort of allowed me that room to sort of, err a little bit. But I heavily relied on my team, sort of the research I was doing. I started reaching out actually and trying to find other, like through Anthro connections. I was like, there has to be someone else like that I could possibly know, who's had this sort of experience. And I ended up finding someone that had also graduated from the Harvard Anthro who was working at Facebook. And I was like, can you give me any advice? Like, can you help me out here? And so, learning how to write a screener, I didn't know what that was, right? And understanding and thinking about scoping out like a project and coming up with a research plan, but like one specifically suited to, this tech space. And thinking about, we were doing a diary study and, we had this like online platform. So figuring out how to navigate this online platform, we were asking people to upload videos and, we had a chat room for them and figuring, just putting all these elements together. It was a lot of trial and error and a lot of, luckily like good folks to lean on to help me. And I loved it. Honestly, I loved every moment of it. Like it's challenging, and it really was challenging. It took me a good 2.5 months before I felt comfortable like leading this project and being like, okay, I think I have a handle on this. And then started to implement some sort of organizational changes. And then the reporting. That was a new thing for me, right? I remember I did my first report. And I asked my manager, one of the VPs, I was like, can you look at this? And she looked at it and she was reading through it. And she's like, Lisanne, this would be a great journal article. Like if we were writing a journal article on the unboxing experience, she was like, we'd be killing it. She's like, but this is a report going to executives at Dell. They're going to look at this for like 5 minutes. And in those 5 minutes, they need to know, like, what is the executive summary? What is the takeaway? And is there any actions that I'm recommending that they take based on this research? So I was like, oh, I need to cut this. She was like, yeah, by like 75%. So that too, that was a learning experience. And, like your audience, right? Like I learned, I had to learn to write for a very different audience.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny that you pivoted into that story because I was going to ask you, did you bring in any of your academic baggage into the process? Because, without having like, again, you said that they would be there if needed, but without having sort of like the past experience and sort of stepping right in, you don't really have anybody to guide you. So is there any other funny things that you sort of brought in, some of the language of academia or anything else that?
I did. Like, I mean, my wordy sentences, and I think I used "moreover" in one of my bullet points, and she was like, "More, Lisanne, no." I think I started, I actually think I even was like, and if talking to her, like, oh, like, is there like a theory behind this? And she was like, no, you can't. Those are not things we talk about, like in reports, Lisanne. Like, and these were really long reports. These were like, 100-slide like PowerPoint decks. And then even learning to work in PowerPoint like that, to sort of, that was a report, like not like a long, not a Word document, but like PowerPoint and really having to become more visual. Learning how to bring that aspect in and sort of thinking about it from a visual perspective as well as like content. And that was a really interesting experience for me. And there was a graphic designer on the team who really helped me to sort of, like he would be like, okay, Lisanne, write out what you want to say. And he's like, and then I'm going to show you how like I would translate this into like, some more visuals. And that was, and we worked together, and that really helped me, especially going forward as I continued sort of being a UX researcher and then going to work at tech companies themselves, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, design is one of those things I think every researcher and really probably everybody should have a little bit of understanding, right?
Yeah.
To be able to communicate visually is really important. And so, can you speak anything else, just given the scope of that project? I find it kind of particularly interesting. So are there any other like new methods, anything that you got into? I know you said survey, but obviously journey mapping.
Yeah. Survey, journey mapping, like sort of understanding, understanding what that was and what was the best way to communicate that. And we, a lot of trial and error with that. What else did we get into? And learning to do analysis in a very different way, right? Like really like having it, like using a spreadsheet, like an Excel spreadsheet to do analysis and to, like figuring out other ways to, like how would we tag? How do we code? The other thing, task analysis. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that was a thing. And we were doing like a lot of task analysis. What other skills did we pick up on? Those were the big ones for me. Like it was that task analysis piece, the survey piece, and then learning how to craft a concise, effective report.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what's particularly interesting about that last point is that you're doing all these things over a very long period of time, right? There's a lot of artifacts that are being created, and that goes well beyond just sort of like the textual, PhD sort of way of approaching it, right? So we have all these artifacts that then in your case, you need to bring together and then report on in a concise way. And so that in itself is kind of challenging, right? Especially given, again, the length and scope of the project. So how did you navigate that particularly? Like, you have your task analysis, you have your journey maps, you have interviews and some observations, whatever, maybe survey data. So how did you bring that all together into a concise way?
We like team effort. Honestly, I realized early on, because I started out being like, I'm going to like have my hands and I'll oversee every aspect of this. And I was literally making myself crazy. I was working like 14-hour days. I was, a Halloween, my husband went to the costume party. I was at my computer like, okay, I've got to get this report and then like have the survey. How am I going to tie this in? And so I learned to like really rely on my team and delegate and figure out like, what were the skills and the interests of the different folks on the team, and then be able to assign them to those different parts. Like we had someone whose role, because they wanted also to see every single touch point, like every email, every call, every like recording. So we had somebody on communications, like, and sort of combing through that. And then we would all get together in a room like once a week and be like, okay, what do we have? Like, talk to me from like the survey and the dashboard, like their diary study, right? Talk to me about like, the qual interviews we did this week, like, and that was my piece. And then we're like, okay, what does the comms look like? And then task analysis, like, and we would sort of like work together as a team to sort of be like, what's the theme? And that's going through all of these? What's the trend? What are we seeing? Like, how do they all sort of tie together? And it was, I really learned how to collaborate. Like I realized before I hadn't been collaborating. Like I didn't know what collaboration was, and we also started to use things like a Gantt chart and like Asana to sort of keep track, because like, there were so many moving pieces and so many people. We had like almost 30 people in the study who were at different phases and who were doing different things. And so, really learning also that organizational piece of it to sort of keep everything in track and like learning that transparency and sort of making sure that like we were moving at a good pace and everybody was aware of what was going on. So that was also, and that's when I really learned like to realize how much I loved that, how much I loved being in sort of that position, leading a team, sort of keeping us on track, keeping it together, but also to like empowering those folks to like own pieces of it that like they could sort of really get into and then hone their skills. And we actually started doing skill sharing, like as a team, like figuring out, like helping people do survey design, helping folks do more visualization. And and then holding like design thinking workshops to work through like when we started to get to like really nitty gritty difficult parts. And that's been the first time I didn't know what a design thinking workshop was. I was like, what are we doing? Like, you want me to store? You want me to draw? I don't draw.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, if you know squares, circles, and triangles are all right.
Yeah, that's all I had. And stick figures. That was my favorite thing.
It gets you most of the way there. Yeah, no, it's good, and it makes sense of why you've gone down more so this sort of UX research leadership role, right? That's a really formative experience early on to kind of help you figure out how do you really pull all that together, and so maybe then jumping forward to out of those more sort of tried and true industries to something a little bit more fun. Certainly the Gusto website has. I haven't seen the product, but obviously the website has a modern feel, right? And so it's kind of classic modern tech now. So what was that transition like, going from like a Dell or a Visa to I don't know if it's a startup-ish culture, but something a little bit more like that?
It's funny. I was just talking to someone about that. It's still a bit of a transition for me. I have to be honest. I'm not like this ambiguous, like this ambiguity is, like norm at startups. I find that a little bit difficult, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I'm sort of like, what are we doing? Can we explore what we're doing? Is this the path we're going down? Okay, let's go down this path. But, I had to learn to be like, okay, we're going to go halfway down that path and be like, oh, no, forget that. Let's move on. Let's switch and try this. So that's been a transition for me. And I think I'm getting a little better at it now. But at first, like, I was really like, but I just invested all this time and energy into, did you not see this research that I did that told us that, it'd be like, no, let's try something different. And so I had to sort of get used to that and not take it personally, right? Like not feel that it was it's not a rejection of my work or what I was doing. It's just more like, this is just the flow and the way in which they work. Mm-hmm. Also, to this idea of one of the things I really like about Gusto is that they do encourage us to be like, you know what, try it, like, and own it. If you see something, there's a gap there, then like, just go start to work on it, and we'll come talk to us about it and we'll support you. Like, if you can show us that it's valid enough, then let's do it, right? So when I got there, they didn't really have a research team. They had one researcher and a research ops team, which I was like, that's great. Because usually that's not what you find. And I sort of just crafted this vision. I was like, look, we need a research team, to support this product. You're trying to, grow as a company. We're going to need more folks to work on these different aspects and to be able to contribute in a more meaningful way. If this is really what we're doing, we're trying to push the product forward. And so, like, I put it together and took it to the one of the co-founders, and he was like, "This is great. Okay, let's go. Let's do it." And I was like, "Oh, okay." This is a little weird. So yeah, and then just really starting to do that work to sort of start to build up a team and figure out how they would be embedded. One of the things that was also really interesting for me that I found moving from, like, say, a Visa to a startup was this idea of like pair design and collaborating with a designer, right? Like having a researcher and a designer really work closely together, as well as a PM and engineers, like, and sort of having them be, not necessarily leading the research, but definitely be a part of the planning, be a part of the visioning for it, and then a part of the analysis piece. So like really sort of getting to change that culture. And I found that A, I loved that, and B, we started producing better products, right? Yeah. Because from the beginning, the designer can see like where someone was struggling, or like, sort of start to see trends that they then took that knowledge with them into the designers in the design process, and then the engineers into the development process. And I've really been enjoying that aspect of it. The one thing I do have to say that's a little weird for me, I'm a New Yorker. I'm very much like, I'm direct and I'm straight. And I find that like people perceive that as being abrupt. Like there's kind of like this California startup kind of way where people will kind of meander around things and don't say things directly. And I'm always like, wait, did you mean this? And they're like, oh, well, yeah, but I was like, okay, let's just say this and let's just keep going. Let's just keep going along. So I've found that I've had to sort of tone it down a little bit. But at the same time, it helped to sort of cut through like things that should have been a 20-minute meeting, right? Like I was finding that I was on these 60-minute meetings, and by the end of it, I was like, did we make a decision? Like, are we doing something? So I had to sort of be like, okay, guys, let's reframe this, and let's sort of like, this is what we're aiming. This is what's missing. Let's just get to that 20-minute meetings now. I love it.
So in there, you said something that, we kind of glossed over, but might be helpful for anybody who's relatively new. So you use the word embedded, and then you went on to just sort of describe the team. And so it basically sounds like you have various product teams with one researcher, maybe one designer, one PO or PM, depending on how you title it, and then, some engineers. Is that correct?
Yes. That's kind of how we've been organizing ourselves. And we don't yet have a researcher per product team. We're working towards that very much, but that's the general model. Yeah, that's the idea.
And so in that sense, that creates, there's pros and cons, of course, right? If you're sort of a centralized team where you're sort of shopping everybody out per the need, it's a little easier for the research team to stay aligned. It's less easy for product teams to stay aligned with the research then, and so as you as the leader, if you have people who are embedded that you're leading, what are you doing anything to kind of pull everybody back together and make sure that, insights are appropriately making, their way across the organization?
Yes. And we've been really working on that. So one of the things we do, we make sure to have like a weekly team meeting, right? Where all the researchers get together and we sort of go through our projects that are currently going, and then anything that we might be scoping that's coming up. And one of the reasons that, I think it's really important is that I found like in a lot of these products, there's overlap, right? And at first what I started to notice, I was like, wait, we're talking to users, and then asking them for the same information. Like, let's partner up, right? This allows them to partner up and then be able to get like what they're looking for and to understand, like even for their products. So that's been really good. And then we're sharing insights. We're working on a newsletter. We're also making sure that we have a little bit more visibility now at monthly the whole product, to be able to share out and be like, okay, UXR insights, like this is what we've got, like, across products. And then we try to align like any findings that we have, and that we make sure then to be like, hey, the integrations team, like I was working on payroll, but they mentioned something about these integrations, like, hey, I think this will be really useful for you. So we're also, making sure that we're spreading those insights across. And then we're also working on building a repository, which has been a big challenge.
I know I've never talked to anybody who's cracked it. So if you have it, I'd love to hear it.
We're working on it. If it turns out that this, I will definitely make sure I share it far and wide, because it's a tough one.
Yeah, whoever cracks that and writes the paper on it is going to get some good visibility, because yes. I've never met anybody who says it's working well.
Yeah.
So you come into this culture, there's only one researcher, which to me would imply that they likely had PMs in place before, like, the research team, which potentially also implies then that the PM was doing research. So are they still, you said that they're still involved, and they should still be involved. Of course, everybody should be involved. But what was that like in the beginning? Because that's one of those things where somebody could walk into a new role, PM, PO might already be doing it. Could be a little friction. So how did you work your way through that?
We're still working our way through some of that. And in many ways, because, the PMs were doing a lot of the research, and they were used to doing it in a certain kind of way that didn't quite match up with the way in which I would like to do the research and have the research done. So we're actually sort of in this transition phase now where, because there's so few of us, we're partnering with them, and we're like making sure, like, okay, come talk to us about the plan. And if we can, we'll help with, some of the interviews and then the analysis. So we're actually taking them down a different route of analysis that they've never done before. Usually what they did, they did their notes in an Excel spreadsheet, and then even their debrief, like after they debriefed after each interview, they would have like a specific set of questions to be like, okay, did we see this? And I was like, well, can we try something different? Can we actually just try let's debrief. What stood out to you? What are the things that like you were like, wait a minute, that was interesting, or look at, the person said this, and that was a change for them. And it was, and then I was like, okay, so after this, let's take those and let's actually work in Lucid Spark. Let's get in a chart and let's get in this, this whiteboard, and let's put those insights in and let's talk about them. Let's, do some affinity mapping. So it's been a journey, and they were, it's taking longer than they would have liked, because usually, they quick turnaround. But they're also finding, they're like, oh, I didn't realize that. Like, we were looking at the security thing, and I was like, yes, but like, there's what's underlying that, and what is it really speaking to, and how can we look at that and then bring that into the product that will actually delight, and so it was showing them how, like, that it's worth the effort to take the extra time. And so we're really trying to work on that and partner with them, because the other thing is too, is we have, marketing doing research. So then, talking to each other about like, what are the different perspectives that we're taking on as we do this research? And then how can we sort of work together as well, to make sure that whatever research we're doing, we can both be able to use or can assist us in whatever our ultimate goal is. So that's been a process. I think it's going well so far. But we're really, and what they're seeing is too, like, oh, we really do need more researchers. So that's the other thing too. It's like the PMs are being like, hey, who do I talk to? Who do I talk to say we need more researchers? And I'm like, yes, keep putting that message forward. So fingers crossed.
Definitely a good sign when they're asking for it. Yeah, what you said in there, it's kind of like, it reminds me of the product process, and I work in both product and UX, and we obviously there are sort of different perspectives for, which is obvious to say, but it's kind of like often in the PM space, it seems to come more from like a searching for known unknowns.
Yes.
And less sort of inductive in finding more of the unknown unknowns, and so they can complement each other for sure. But it is interesting to see, because, in Scrum and such methodologies, which, get stacked on top of the agile sort of philosophy and, are involved in a lot of tech, the product person is doing the research. So it is, as UX gains, more foothold, it is, an interesting, it's an interesting process to watch each organization navigate. And then you said also that you have marketing, which is, also doing some research, which is a whole nother layer and a whole nother way of doing research yet again.
Yes.
Which is interesting. And of course, all those perspectives together can be really great, but it's again a process of, being kind of the culture broker and bringing it all together.
Yes. And that's where I think too, like one of the things I was talking about with Rachel Fleming, she's also an anthropologist, and Rachel, is like how we're the, we end up being this cultural broker between these different groups and being like mediators and able to sort of, right, because we kind of can step back and be like, okay, like, you're using different language. You're using this, like, let's figure out a way that like we can understand each other and we can communicate across like our different kind of silos. Because that's what I've found is gets so problematic as a company, particularly startups start growing, is that silo starts happening and no one's thinking like, how do we talk across that? Because at the end of the day, it's for the customer, it's just one experience, right? And we have to be able to think of it in that way and think about how we're all different pieces of it and understand what's happening like in these different pieces so that we can create an optimal overall great experience.
Yeah, and that's of course even more challenging when there's different products. So it seems like maybe did you start in one space like payroll and then sort of branch out into other areas, or?
No, like I'm sort of just looking at it all, which is why like, I get that sort of step back perspective to sort of look at it all, like payroll, benefits. There's an accountant piece to it. Like there's a lot of different moving pieces. And it's sort of like, for me, stepping back and looking at like, how do they all work together? Where is there friction? Where do some just not work together? And then being able to find researchers who can then work on the specific different parts of the product.
And though the product though, did they start in one area and then keep adding on like additional HR services?
Yeah, Gusto started out really doing just payroll. Like they realized that was the biggest pain point for small, and very particularly for small, medium businesses, like, but small, like 1 to 10 employees. Like that's their sweet spot. and built a great product for that. And now they're sort of looking to sort of keep shifting, right? Like keep adding more folks to that. So the product grew to include benefits as well. And that was a huge move and shift for them because there was a demand for it. And so they're kind of looking to keep expanding a little bit more in that space to offer even more on the platform.
So benefits is one of those things we've all gone through, as employees, and it's often complex, right? It's often difficult, just tough to make sense of. And so, especially right now during COVID, how have you been sort of navigating what the employee experience is like using, or is it HR that's using the tool, or is it also the end user, like the employee?
It's both. So that's it's usually for the benefits piece, though, it's really mostly HR. The employee uses a tool more from like a financial perspective, like they, being able to get their pay, being able to create a savings account, being able to have a wallet. So it's really figuring out how to help that HR admin navigate that. And I wasn't there really during the early COVID piece of it, but I kind of, when I came in, I saw what they did, and they really, they were great about offering so many resources to their customers to figure out how do we navigate this for payroll? How do we navigate this for our benefits, to get through COVID? And that's one of the things I think that, so many of our customers now were sort of giving us kudos about, Gusto, thank you. You helped me navigate what could have been a very horrible experience. And it was difficult for everyone, sure. But you all helped us to make it a little bit easier by being so upfront and connecting with other, going above and beyond and, connecting with, CDC for the Small Medium Business Bureau to then have those direct resources available on the platform so that people would be able to get help and it'd be continually up to date.
Yeah, that's nice. One of the things that strikes me as being challenging, when I kind of like finance, HR, at least in my experience, HR tends to have a lot of paper processes still, right? And, of course, not all industries are like that. I mean, I haven't had a pen on my desk in 20 years, it's just, I'm a tech person. But, there's some areas, functional units of business that are still very paper oriented, and HR is certainly one of them. And so maybe you haven't had the opportunity yet because of COVID, but it also seems like a ripe area to really be doing in-context research, understanding the work practice of somebody in their office.
Yes.
Is that something you're planning to kind of get into post-COVID?
Yes, we're definitely planning to get into that because it does make it difficult, right? Because we're talking to people now, of course, using Zoom and whatnot, and we hear about all of these manual processes still that folks are doing, particularly in the space of hiring. That's really where we've seen a lot of this manual paper this use. So people have files. Somebody still was yeah, no, I have a file cabinet with people's resumes in it, and I was that's incredible. And I was we're all thinking, how do we make that digitally for you now, right? How do we get you to use Greenhouse to then integrate with Gusto? So I can't wait. Yeah, we've already started thinking forward and starting to plan when do we think we'll be able to safely, go back into offices and what will that look like for us going forward? Because it's true, we really need to be sort of shadowing folks and sort of seeing actually what they're doing, because that's going to really help us to figure out particularly how they collaborate with each other. That's been something that we've recently realized is a huge challenge, and that no one in the space yet is quite doing it right. People are trying, but it's still a pretty frustrating experience. So that's going to be something that we're particularly going to want to do, in-person contextual inquiry on.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that would be fun to get back. I know everybody we talked to is dying to get back into the field, be it. So how about, in this, to go back to a little bit to mentorship and sort of the startup culture, all along your career, obviously you've been learning new skills. As soon as you walked into Dell, you learned new methods and, new artifacts and all that stuff. But I'm wondering, is there anything sort of UX adjacent that you have been working on, anything in the product space, that you've been sort of trying to upskill yourself on or your team on that just helps UX be sort of a better player?
Yeah, that's a great question. So recently I've been really pushing sort of, inclusive design, and really asking us, so like, how can we start thinking about, how do we start to change some of the processes that we have in product design to go through exercises where we think about our biases, right? Where we think about, recognize them, and then how do we work to mitigate those biases in design? Like, how do we think about like who our end users are, and start to think about that, people have different experiences, based on things that people don't want to talk about, like based on gender, based on race. It's just a reality of our lives. It's a lived experience. So one of the things, we're really looking to do is to start to think through like, how can we change? And we've been, looking at folks like Project Inkblot, thinking of possibly having them in to come, help us walk through a framework to help to redesign our processes to make it more inclusive and have it be something that's more long-term. We're also been taking a lot of from Benjamin Earl Evans. We had a fireside with him where he came in and sort of talked to us about what he was doing to mitigate inequity on the Airbnb platform. And to sort of think about, like us doing our own audits and assessments internally to see like where are we not missing the mark, right? So we're starting to go down that route and and to really think about these things. And it's been great to see Gusto be so open to that, and to embracing that kind of a change, and to also think about, like now asking for demographic information. Like we weren't asking any of our businesses for any kind of demographic information, but now being like, what, we're doing a disservice by not doing that, and for making an assumption that everybody's using the platform exactly the same way. It's just not true. People have different businesses in different locations, and there's going to be variances. So that's the other thing too that we're starting to talk about, because that also helps us when we're recruiting for our studies, right? Like making sure that we have like representative folks that are a part of our participant pool. So that's also been, really great in undertaking that, sort of leading that effort there, as well as doing that outside of Gusto. Like one of the things we talked about, and that's been really proud of, particularly that we did this during COVID, was starting Black UX Austin, which is a group for, folks who identify descent in the Austin area who work in UX to create a safe space where people can talk about their experiences, get some advice, get mentorship even, right? Think about like, hey, I'm new to the field. We see a lot of that. Hey, I'm new to this field of UX. How should I get started? What are some of the things that you would recommend? As well as, bringing in speakers who sort of, who talk. Like we had Ovetta Sampson in, who's like an amazing, product lead at Microsoft, to sort of talk about her experience. We also do have panels where we had, for Latin History Month, we had like a panel of, Latinos in tech to be like, let's talk about your experience. Like everybody assumes, oh, we're all folks of color, but we have different experiences, right? So it's been a really, it's been a great just to sort of really promote this organization and grow it. And hoping that we get back to in-person events soon.
Yeah, we all are for sure. But so we'll come back to some recommendations there because you mentioned that word. But just to dive into this a little bit. So, how do you look at, for anybody who's listening that's maybe not already looking at inclusive design, how would you sort of frame that?
I would frame it in what way? I just want to make sure that I'm answering the question.
How would you explain it maybe to somebody who's
okay? Totally. Yeah, I would think about it in this terms, right? Like a lot of the products that we use, right? Like we all use digital products like throughout our lives. And most of these products are designed by mostly white men who then only test these products on white men. So if we think about, for instance, Google was, really working with their self-driving cars. And when they started to do the test, they realized that, over like high percentage, like 35 to 45% of the times, these vehicles would strike folks with darker skin tones. And then they went back and they're like, wait, this is so strange. Why would this be? But it turns out it was because, the AI they were using, they'd only been feeding images of lighter skinned, predominantly white people into this, into this database. And so it was, again, it hadn't occurred to them because when you looked at the design team and the engineering team, they were predominantly male and predominantly white males. It hadn't occurred to them, right? So in this idea of inclusive design, it's like expanding and thinking about, other folks who don't look like me. Like, if I'm really designing for everyone, then when I'm doing research, when I'm doing testing, I should be getting people who are representative of the population in the United States. That would mean like testing on, like African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, like everyone. So the idea is that if you're truly saying that your product is for everyone, then you should have thought of everyone while you were doing it. And the other thing too to think about that is also who might be most harmed by this product, right? Like who might be that community that would be most vulnerable? And then thinking of starting to design from that point, right? From understanding, because if I design for that community, then everyone will end up benefiting from this design and it'll truly be inclusive. And I think that more companies are starting to really sort of understand that, to sort of take a step back, and think about like, oh, wait a minute, right? Like I assume that everyone can, but I really don't know because I didn't actually like take everyone into consideration or as many different kinds of folks into consideration, like when I created this product.
Yeah. And so, two comments to that. One is, of course, it's not just, are we recruiting, a diverse population and are we testing on a diverse population and thinking of that diverse population then when designing, but also are we diversifying, the team so it is not just the white tech bro team that's in their hoodies sort of playing games at night and building products that's at least to, one neighborhood only.
Yes. And that's the other piece of it too, right? Like that we're thinking about, and that, one of the things too behind Black UX Austin was like finding folks to then be able to say, hey, like for those of us who are more senior in the industry, like, can we help you to develop to the point that we can help you find jobs, right? Like in this industry and in this space. And I will have to say, I'm going to have to plug Gusto and give them lots of kudos because we're going through this huge hiring piece right now. We're hiring a lot of designers. We're about to hire 2 senior UX researchers. And we've been so intentional about how we're sourcing, like who we're looking for, right? Like we're really going through LinkedIn and we're tapping networks and we're really sort of asking ourselves, have we done due diligence, right? And one of the things that I'm also sort of now pushing for and becoming more aware of is like, are we limiting who we're looking at because we're looking for folks who only have a college degree, who have a college degree, a 4-year college degree? Like, are we not, like, how do we open up the search so that we're also getting folks who have a lot of experience, who've been doing this for a long time, who on the job experience and who are going to bring a lot to the table, right? Because they are going to have a different perspective from somebody who went to a 4-year college and, so sort of also thinking about it that way and how that will open up, the diversity of the team, and then the thinking and the approach.
Yeah, and an argument for that previously you had said about, design for those who might be most harmed. And, I'll just sort of summarize, the rest will almost kind of take care of itself. And one of the things that brings up to me is, we need to start thinking beyond the product a little bit. There's all these externalities that we're now realizing are happening that, go beyond the maybe assumed use, right, of the product. And oftentimes those externalities are on those with less power, of course, or at least the negative impacts oftentimes fall there. And so it also brings up, aside from maybe getting people who don't just have the classic sort of background, right, education or otherwise, it also brings up like, a whole new skill set really, right? It's not just the near-term thinking about, what does this feature do for this particular user in the HR office, and maybe Gusto is not the best platform to have this discussion, whereas like Facebook, it's very easy to have a conversation about something like externalities, but to start thinking kind of into the future. And I think this is a little bit where, to maybe tie it back to the PhD, but having that critical perspective it certainly lends itself to start thinking through those kind of problems. But, and you and I, in a previous conversation briefly talked about this, but it also sort of oftentimes stops short of, well, what do we do next? Right. And so that is, if you want to go down that path, I'm happy to do it. I find the critical perspective very interesting, very useful, but it also to me feels like, oftentimes arrested in like before it gets to the recommendations. And so like, how do we start thinking bigger in not just being inclusive in who we bring again into the research process and who's on the team, but really to kind of more from like a design anthropology or sort of futures perspective, really start thinking of like these externalities and the groups that it's going to harm. Like, how do we make that leap? Any thoughts on that?
That's a good question. I guess for me, because the thing is, I tend to think through that, and I'm finding now that like I tend to think of next step and be like recommendation, be like, okay, what's the actions that we could possibly take? So I think one of the things that is having more anthropologists, like folks who have that kind of thinking to come in and then be able to sort of, like, I keep like concept dreaming, but that's not the word I'm thinking of, but being able to sort of, like you said, think forward and offer up like possible visions of what that could look like. Right? Because that's the thing, like we sort of do the research, but you're right. But even like thinking like externally, like what kinds of things could happen, like I think being given the freedom to do that. And I think that what I've seen anyway is like folks who do that, but aren't because that future thinking or that idea of like considering like what can be the like external possible harms or even positive things that can happen. Folks aren't interested in necessarily, they're more interested in the here and now. Mm-hmm. And I think that giving folks just the freedom to do that, because I already think that there are people who do it. And I can't go into, but I know there are folks vertical on certain platforms at certain places we've discussed who did do that, right? Who, came and were like, you know what, actually, if we implement this, like, here's some possible things that could happen in the future that just won't be positive. But because in the initial product, it was going to make a lot of money, right? And I think that's the other thing, the piece to it is thinking ethically, like, and bringing those ethics into play and sort of really having the power to do that. I don't think we're empowering enough folks. I think, even researchers and designers to really think ethically, and think beyond like, what is the dollar gain here? Right? Like, how do we do that? Like, I don't think that there's enough encouragement of that. And that's something I've been trying to talk to people a little bit more about. And I think there's a certain openness, I think, to it at Gusto, but it is a business, right? So I think it's being able to then create the space so that we can like think forward and think like, okay, if we do this in the future, like, what is it going to affect? And, oh, wow, if it has this effect, let's talk about it. Like, let's think this through, like, and then decide, is it worth it? Which I think that too many of those conversations didn't happen, but there were definitely people doing that work. So I think that it's been there. It's just a matter of like actually giving space to it and being and making and willing to sacrifice capital monetary gain in order to not cause future harm. I think I don't know if our society is ready for that, Matt.
Yeah, well, the thing about it, and we've seen a lot of people leave some leading companies recently over ethical issues, and maybe they're doing this, maybe they're not, but I wonder, is there an opportunity to connect that kind of thinking more clearly to strategy, right? Because if it is not a sustainable strategy over time, then there is a monetary impact. And so maybe again, even the sort of, maybe the futures thinking where we're offering up these scenarios in and of itself is still not enough. And it's still, then how do we tie that back really to something tangible that a business can understand, like, strategic intent and like that body of knowledge to show how, over time, it may actually cause, a negative impact. It might have a bigger financial impact over time, ultimately. And, obviously I don't have the answer to that today either, but it's, I think somehow we all need to start kind of getting on a way, like pulling together a framework for sort of working in this space other than simply sort of visioning what it may be. Because, while it's useful, if it doesn't convince anybody in the business, because
then it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Like an example I love is from Sarah Pink, who she talks about driverless cars, and she mentions how, everybody's talking about, do you, the person's crossing the street, who do you hit, right? Do you harm the people in the car or the person on the street? And she's like, it's not even a question to me. What about the person that mods the computer, right? that hacks the computer and writes their own software, so they always kill the other person. It's not a question of what we design in that case. It's like, what does the person who basically jailbreaks the car do, right? So there's so many unintended that we can't think of, but still, okay, that's a great argument for having that style of thinking. But now, what does that really mean to the bottom line, and what do we do about it still? And so I don't know.
Yeah.
I would love to see what, I would love to see what somebody else is doing in that space and how they might be clearly articulating the financial impact.
Yeah, I would love to see that as well. But again, you'd have to have, even articulating, but you'd still have to find who are open to that, right? Like who are like, okay, you know what, this is the social impact outweighs the monetary gain. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know if we're there yet.
Yeah, no, I hear you. But, it's obviously becoming important. The days of just sort of digitizing some basic, accounting process, we're way past that. I mean, I oftentimes don't talk about my own projects on the podcast, but we're designing an app right now for the art space, right? So think of all the diversity inclusion problems in the art space.
Yeah.
And so these are things we're trying to actively work through, because you could just build a better mousetrap and simply amplify them, via a digital tool and make it even worse, right? Yeah. And so, it's a great space, and I'm glad you're doing it. So more about to go tie it back here to Black UX in Austin. So, you're basically doing some mentorship there, obviously having guest speakers, helping others sort of see the path as it will, and bring them into the process, help them find jobs. And so for, any African Americans or really any, people of color, do you have any sort of broad recommendations, based on so far your experience with the group?
One of the things I tell people to connect, right? That's the first. Like, if you're interested in this space, we have so many ways to, find a meetup, right? Like, find us on Meetup if you're in Austin. Find a meetup of practitioners who are meeting, of UX folks, and join the meeting. Talk to folks and find out what it's about. And if it's something that, really interests you. And if you are interested in this space, continue to sort of try to network with those folks. Set up, I tell people all the time, find someone, just send them a message on LinkedIn and set up a 30-minute coffee. Like, hey, introduce yourself. Hey, I'm interested in this. Would you, mind talking to me? You'll find that a lot of people are more than willing to do this, right? And I think also too, think about, because I know some people have managed to sort of, do the boot camp or follow the sort of courses. And one of the things I recommend is to look in your community and approach somebody in the community at a community nonprofit and ask them, are there certain aspects of the folks the community you serve that you don't know and you'd like to understand more, and volunteer to do a project for them and to help them with something, because then you're helping the community and you're also getting something great to put in your portfolio, because people are going to want to see some kind of, particularly if you're, even if you're junior now, folks want to see something, right? And you want to be able to show them something beyond just, what you did in the boot camp or for a course, but, to show that that shows that you're proactive and you went out in the community and you sort of created something. Then it shows just how much benefit then you were able to sort of add to that organization as well. The other thing is, do the research. There's so many resources online, and now in this kind of Zoom world, there are a lot of groups that are meeting online, right? So I think that's also democratized and made access a lot easier for folks. But even if you don't see someone, who looks like you, because often in these spaces you won't, still reach out to someone and sort of, to learn a little bit more. Don't be intimidated by that, right? And that's the thing, just don't be intimidated, right? Like be a cheerleader for yourself, essentially is what I tell people a lot of the time. Because, there are opportunities there. It's just a matter of like, putting yourself out there and making that first step. But really, I say network, sort of, again, try doing these projects and talk to people. Like, that's really how you'd be surprised at, like what can come out of like a simple 30-minute conversation.
Great. And, so just to challenge you on something now, I do suggest to people you volunteer. And, often a lot of volunteers can be taken advantage of by the organization. Like the organizations have a way of asking for more and more and more when they're getting free help sometimes. So have you just, any thoughts there for anybody who, might be in that position where they're struggling to get like sort of any, they sort of need something and, maybe volunteering is going to be it, but to help them not sort of get taken advantage of, really?
In the volunteering experience,
yeah.
Saying? For a lot, that's true. So what I tell folks is that, like go in already sort of knowing, like speak to them and sort of, like you've had a little experience now, like sometimes people be like, oh, can you speak to like 80 people? Be like, you know what, that's not really feasible. Like I can speak to 12 people and probably see some patterns that could help you sort of, understand a little bit more, as well as time box it, right? Like you don't have unlimited time. So sort of be like, you know what, this is something that I can help you with over the course of a month or two, right? Like, and it wouldn't be, so I can, sort of set your limits up front. I think that's one way, the advice that I've given folks so that doesn't happen. So far, no one's been, maybe folks have been going to really great volunteer experiences. Nobody's had that kind of a crazy experience. And it's actually led to some really great partnerships for them actually later on in their career. I will say that.
Yeah, good. Well, that's really good to hear. So to wrap up, anything you want to plug, anything aside from, what we've already mentioned, anything else you want to bring up?
No, just, I hope like folks, if you're interested, check out Black UX Austin. Please, I recommend folks read up on inclusive design. I think that all of us, who are in this business should be aware of it. And if you want to, I'm on LinkedIn. That's actually probably the best way to find me. I'm totally open to, connect and talking, having conversations with folks. I'm not big on Twitter or other social media avenues. So LinkedIn would probably be the best way to, if you want to connect and continue having some of these conversations.
Great. Well, Lisanne, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Matt. This was great.
Thank you all for listening to the Anthro to UX podcast. To learn everything you need to break into UX, visit anthro2ux.com. There you will find all the podcast episodes and career coaching resources. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.